The philosophy of history is an enormous subject of very great age, which most of the peoples of the world have taken an interest in. It covers a huge variety of disciplines, starting from simply the review of historical facts in a slightly more general framework than narrow specialists tend to do it. Sometimes it takes the form of curiosity of a philosophical kind about the kind of concepts that are used, an inquiry into, for example, how words like because or for the sake of are used in history, how the word because in history differs from the word because used in common sense or in the sciences, how, for example, the word why is asked in historical questions as opposed to questions in the sciences. But most often of all, the philosophy of history consists in a search for patterns in human behavior. This search sometimes springs again from ordinary human curiosity on the part of people who simply want to know whether there is some kind of explanation of a general kind which will throw light on why human societies develop as they do, and what is the relationship between groups of people throughout history. More often it springs from a deeper concern with something which religion and metaphysics sometimes supply. People are naturally anxious to know where they come from and where they are going, why they exist, and what life is for, what are the things for the sake of which it is worth fighting and sometimes dying. And people who are dissatisfied with traditional metaphysics and have lost the ancient religious faith in which they were usually brought up, sometimes look to history for an answer to these questions. That has certainly been the case with a number of 20th century philosophers of history, for example, Spengler or Toynbee, who quite plainly look in the facts of history for some kind of justification as well as explanation of why things happen as they do, for the sources of fear and hope, for some kind of universal pattern into which all the scattered ingredients of the universe around them could be grouped so as to display some kind of purpose, some kind of unity, some kind of harmony in terms of which the bits could be understood. These people look on history as a kind of jigsaw puzzle, such that if only the bits could be fitted together, the purpose and the rationale of the whole would at last become revealed, and human life could at last be led in accordance with principles which would ensure some kind of lasting satisfaction. Now, one of the great factors which has made for this hope that it is possible to find a pattern in history has, of course, been the great success of science. The natural sciences are a story of a human endeavor in which, from a comparatively few simple principles, it is possible to deduce the behavior and the position of all the particles of matter of which the universe is composed. And naturally, the great triumph of this essentially simple method bounds its spell on people ever since the 17th century, when it first, at any rate in the West, became a great and influential discipline, bound its spell on people, and people who were puzzled in other spheres of life, in the spiritual sphere or in the sphere of historical investigation, began quite reasonably to hope that perhaps here too one could find a pattern which would do the job which it had done in the sciences. So that from a few simple formulae one would be able to reduce the whole vast scattered heap of facts to some kind of rational order. Well, people have tried, but on the whole the efforts have not been a great success, and that is really one of the things that I want to try and explain. If history really follows a scientific pattern, it should be possible to produce some kind of theory which would be to the facts of human life very much as, say, the theory of physics is to practical, applied physics, say engineering. As mathematics is to physics, as theoretical physics is to engineering, so theoretical history, the pure theory of history, call it sociology if you like, would be to the actual facts, let's say to applied history. and yet nobody so far has produced this shortcut, has produced some kind of instrument with which one is able to predict into the future and to fill up the gaps which we don't know about the past in the same sort of successful and impressive way in which, for example, astronomers can predict eclipses and can also tell you what eclipses must have happened in the past. Now, why hasn't this been done? Some people certainly thought they were doing it. Karl Marx, for example, who was perhaps one of the most influential, if not the most influential secular thinker of our time, certainly thought that in some sense you could produce a science of history, and prided himself on the fact that he had really founded something of the sort as against the muddled philosophical utopias which had preceded him. Well, Karl Marx was, of course, an extremely penetrating, powerful thinker, indeed a man of genius. He had certain brilliant insights, in the light of which we are still living. The nature, for example, of economic causation in history, the fact that people are caused to think as they do by certain economic facts of which they may be unaware and which they explain away in all kinds of fallacious ways, is largely due to Marx. He had a very profound grasp about the self-destructive activity of human groups, about the fact that people might think that they were doing something in order to improve their condition, but owing to certain inevitable distortions brought about by their economic status, they were in fact working towards their own destruction without knowing it, which is what he supposed capitalist society was doing. He had a profound insight into human nature when he regarded man as not having a fixed nature, but as transforming himself and his environment by means of his labor, and thus, in the very course of seeking his solution, altering the human nature for which the solution was a solution. In other words, he was one of the earliest thinkers to realize that human nature was not something fixed and eternal, but something which men themselves altered in the course of trying to satisfy its needs. All these are very important and very profound ideas, and we owe them to him, and he is therefore a very cardinal thinker and a man of obvious genius. Nevertheless, the claim which he made to be a scientist obviously rests upon the capacity of prediction, because the first criterion of a successful science is, of course, ability to move from the known to the unknown, to be able to predict something which would not have been predictable on the basis of unscientific common sense. As a prophet, Marx was certainly not very successful. He foresaw the rise of big business, but when he tried to describe, for example, the revolution, he made certain mistakes with which everybody is now familiar. For example, the Russian Revolution, as we all know, which was made in his name, occurred not in the wrong country, at the wrong time, and was made by the wrong people, if you accept Marxist orthodoxy. It should have occurred in a highly industrialized country. It occurred in a country of primitive economy. It should have occurred at a time when there was already a rising class of industrial workers. It occurred in a country in which the industrial workers were few and weak. In China, similarly, the revolution was largely made by embattled peasants who, according to Marx, were fundamentally petty bourgeois in outlook and a reactionary group of persons likely to be a hindrance rather than a stimulus to human progress. In Germany, where Karl Marx confidently expected a revolution, the revolution was prevented by the very bureaucracy and the very excellence of the organization of the working class in which Marx had placed all his revolutionary hopes. England and Holland, countries where he expected the revolution to occur peacefully, didn't experience his kind of revolution at all. On America, he said nothing which was of great interest. Now, I don't want simply to stress Marx's errors. The things which he got right are more numerous, on the whole, probably, than the things which he got wrong. What I wish to explain is that what is wrong here, and applies not merely to Marx, but to Auguste Comte and to all kinds of people who thought that they could make history into a science, is that there is a sort of doctrinariness about this. Now, when we speak about a historian as being doctrinaire, this seems to be a kind of criticism. It isn't a criticism if we say it of a scientist, and this is an important point. When you say about a physicist that he has a doctrine, this is not in any way pejorative. Obviously, the business of physics is to have doctrines, general propositions from which you can deduce particular consequences in the future and the past. You may say that of a physicist that he holds the wrong doctrine, but not that it is in some way against him that he has a doctrine at all. But now in history, if you say of a historian that he is doctrinaire, the implication is that he is trying to force the facts into some kind of straitjacket of theory, which they won't fit, and that there is something wrong with the man who is trying to press these facts into the straitjacket. There is, in other words, some sort of suspicion that the kind of jacket which fits physics is a straitjacket when it is applied to history. Let me try and expand this a little, because it's really the central point which I'm trying to make. A science is only a success when it produces a model, a kind of abstract model, which is really a kind of network of general propositions, which produces a kind of idealized entity, like the ideal atom or the ideal economic man, in terms of which it can explain the behavior of a lot of real things, which deviate more or less from the ideal thing. So that the ideal model is a kind of entity which helps you to understand the behavior of real objects, because it's a kind of abstraction from them. The more abstract the science is, the more successful it is. Mathematics, which abstracts only one aspect of things, namely their quantity, is perhaps the most successful of all our sciences. Physics, which abstracts very few of the properties of what things have in common, is also a great success. The less you abstract, the less powerful your instrument of prediction becomes. Biology abstracts less than physics, and to that extent is a less dependable science. Why? Because there are too many characteristics which have to be looked after. The model is too complicated, necessarily, because you want to talk about all these characteristics. In other words, the more you can abstract, the more powerful your science is, but also the fewer characteristics it will cover. The less you abstract, the more concrete the subject matter, the more characteristics you are talking about, the less you can use the model and the less you are able to predict. These things happen in some kind of inverse ratio. In history, you are trying to talk about far too many things. You are trying to talk about men not only as biological beings, not only as persons who take part in economic exchange, not only people who have political relationships, not only people who are bound together by all kinds of moral, intellectual, aesthetic relationships. You are trying to talk about men in the concrete. And insofar as you are trying to talk about them as rounded creatures, compounded of many qualities, it's extremely difficult to construct a schema which is both going to be abstract enough and formal enough to be used by a science, and yet rich enough and comprehensive enough to resemble the kind of human beings we truly want to talk about. If you are simply an economic historian, you can do it, because then you say, I am simply looking at a man as an economic entity. I am talking about the woolen trade. I am not interested whether the woolen traders are good husbands or religious men or politically reliable. I look on them simply as men who sell and buy wool, and everything else is irrelevant. If you do that, then you can construct a model of the woolen trader and a science of the development of woolen trade. But if you are interested in their characteristics as human beings, as fathers, as religious men, as citizens, as heaven knows what else, as well, then you can no longer construct a science which depends upon the possibility of abstraction. This comes out very clearly, you see, if you ask yourself a concrete historical question. For example, supposing you ask yourself, what is the role played by individuals in history? Would India have been what she is today if Mr. Gandhi, if Mahatma Gandhi had never lived? Would the Russian Revolution have occurred if Lenin had been killed by a brick dropping on his head in 1916? Would England have resisted the Germans in 1940 if Mr. Churchill had been strangled in his infancy? And if these things hadn't happened, would history have been very different, and in what way? It's quite clear that we think that a great deal of difference might have been made by such things. But if you say how much difference, and can any science give us this difference, it's extremely difficult to know how this could possibly be done. There are really two types of knowledge to be distinguished here. One is the type of knowledge which the scientists possess, which doesn't depend on common sense and doesn't depend on intuition of any kind, which simply consists in careful observation and experiment the checking of results by careful empirical verification, and the accumulation of knowledge and the verification of experiments quite independently of what normal persons would normally expect to happen. That is the way in which we discover that penicillin cures pneumonia. There is no reason intrinsically to think, if you think about penicillin, that it will or will not cure pneumonia. But if statistics show that it does, then it gradually is transformed from a hypothesis into a law. There is another kind of knowledge in which you say, I know a man very well, I know a friend, and I know how this friend is likely to behave. And if you say, but how do you know that this man is not likely to be a thief? Or how do you know that this man is likely to have a very big political effect on an audience? You can't produce the same kind of evidence as you do in the case of penicillin and pneumonia. You know it because you have integrated a very large number of intimate small observations into your general coherent picture of the man's character. And having scrambled this egg, you then can't unscramble it. This is much more like the way in which we know, for example, what happens in history. Natural scientists have to be analytical, they have to have great power of abstraction. Their systems are little repetitive cycles of highly abstract ideal entities. They must expect any kind of combination of existing factors, however surprising, however odd. They must have a capacity for paradoxical thought, for trying to work out what would happen if things were very different from what they are thought to be. The enemy to science is too much sanity, too much common sense control, too much conventional wisdom, too much fear of the strange and the new and the abnormal. The historian's gift seems to me the opposite. He has to have a capacity, first of all, for synthesizing, for viewing facts in the concrete, for distinguishing that which is unique in each situation, not to make X-rays like scientists, but portraits like painters. Above all, his great enemy is too much generality, too much doctrinariness, too much schematization, the view of human beings as entities, objects, what is called human material. The forgetting of the difference which individuals make in the general behavior of masses who are viewed simply as subjects for statistical generalizations and predictions. And this, I think, is the deepest difference which divides these two types of knowledge, and the attempt, therefore, to found a philosophy of history upon the analogy between human studies and the sciences is for this reason doomed to failure, even though people who try and do it, like Kant and Marx and other thinkers, may, while trying to do it, simply because they are extremely gifted and energetic men, come upon discoveries of the greatest importance for mankind.